Deliverer by Tishani Doshi is quite an interesting poem. It details um, the differences in culture between Western culture and Indian culture, how women are treated, and it deals with the quite dark topic of infanticide, which we'll go through later. So, as usual, make sure you understand the terminology on the board. So, religious imagery, graphic imagery, setting. I hope you know what setting is. Stark imagery and consonants, because a lot of that is present within this poem. So again, context is not marked, but it is necessary to understand it in support of knowing what the poem is about. So Doshi is an Indian poet with dual heritage who often uses her poetry to highlight injustice and contemporary issues of gender and race in both the Western and Eastern world. The deliverer focuses on the continued practice of female infanticide in India, a country and culture in which male babies are preferred over girls. Many Indian women do not have access to birth control, and so this creates a cyclical problem. Doshi's own mother did deliver a baby from a convent in India to America, and how the nuns told her about the large scale of abandoned girl children that there are. In this poem, Doshi tries to imagine what the life of this one girl might have been like and the impact that this journey might have had. So some argue that this poem is sort of not first person, but sort of, an account of what occurred. I would argue it's certainly based on that, but I would not go as far to say that this is exactly what happened with her mum and the girl that was adopted and rescued and whatever. I would go as far as say it was inspired by that, and I'll kind of go through my reasons as to why that might be later. So the poem is as follows. The Deliverer. Our Lady of the Light Convent, Kerala. The sister here is telling my mother how she came to collect children because they are crippled or dark or girls, found naked in the streets, covered in garbage, stuffed in bags, abandoned at their doorstep. One of them was dug up by a dog, thinking the head barely poking about the ground above the ground was bone or wood, something to chew. This is the one my mother will bring. Milwaukee Airport, USA. The parents wait at the gates. They are Americans, so they know about ceremony and tradition, about doing things right. They haven't seen or touched her yet, don't know of her fetish for plucking hair off hands, or how her mother tried to bury her. But they are crying. We couldn't stop crying, my mother said, feeling the strangeness of her empty arms. This girl grows up on videotapes, sees how she's passed from woman to woman. She returns to Twilight Corners, the day of her birth, how it happens in some desolate hut outside village boundaries where mothers go to squeeze out life. Watch baby slither out from body, feel for penis or no penis, toss the baby to the heap of others, trudge home to lie down for their men again. So read over that poem, consider what you think about it, what's the story, who's the speaker, what relationships discussed. I would argue here, please note also the different settings. So obviously we've got the first section is based in Kerala in India, and then the second section is in the USA, and the third section is sort of a mixture of the two. So the story is as follows. The poem charts a unique delivery from a convent in Kerala in India to an airport in Milwaukee, America. The deliverer, the speaker's mother, is responsible for the care of the infant who is being brought for international adoption. The poem, which is split into sections, recounts the persona's experience of both affluence and deprivation as explored through the two settings. Doshi conveys a political message about the treatment of women and how the perpetuation of traditional inequalities will maintain the cycle of abuse. And in terms of themes here, we've also got the theme of gender and the different way in which women are treated and men are treated and so on, and that subordination of women as well. We've got society and culture, particularly with American culture versus Indian culture, how different genders are treated in different cultures and so on, and then transgression, the shocking references to murder of newborn babies, is pretty rough, and demonstrating again how different cultures have different views on different genders. So the title itself is dual meaning. So it could obviously mean the biological delivery of a child, like the mum delivers the baby. But it can also reference the idea, the person who delivers the child to her new home. So in this case, it's the speaker's mother. Um, and could also even have religious connotations if we think of Jesus Christ as the deliverer of everything. Potentially, you could argue that the speaker's mother is considered a deliverer. She is rescuing this child, liberating her, saving her, etc. So you can see the religious imagery there, which is then perpetuated in that the first setting is in a convent. Now, a convent's obviously a very religious place, run by nuns who are all women, and they are saving all these children. It's also notice that it's Our Lady of the Light. Lady of the Light is Mary, as in Jesus' mum, Mary. And bear in mind that woman, Mary, gave her only son to save humanity. Like, he was born to save us. So you can see again the correlation between the story of the poem and the deliberate title of the convent. The sister here is telling my mother how she came to collect children because they are crippled or dark or girls. So firstly, the sister, that's the nun sister, not like a brother and sister. The sister is the nun. And the idea that they are collecting children, it objectifies them and depersonalises them. But you can argue that's due to the number of children who need to be saved and collected and so on. So I'd be wary about saying it's because they don't care. I'd argue it's because they care so much that there are just so many to rescue. And then you've got the listing there, the syndetic listing, crippled or dark or girls. It's the listing of the quote unquote undesirable traits within this culture. You know, they don't want women, they don't want them to be disabled in any way, and they don't want them too dark, awful as it sounds. There is a matter of fact tone here, and this is a very commonplace occurrence. You know, this is what some more rural areas of India believe. Now, bear in mind, infanticide is illegal everywhere, I believe, but certainly in India, like, it is illegal, but that doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen. It's usually in the more impoverished areas where birth control is less, well, just basically non-existent, and where girls, to have a girl and get her married off long term, you need something of a dowry. So a poor family would struggle to find the dowry for a daughter, and so therefore in some more rural areas girls are left to die so that they don't have that problem later on. Cheerful. So, found naked in the streets, covered in garbage, stuffed in bags, abandoned at their doorstep. It's really sad. The idea that they're naked, obviously they're newborn. They could not be more innocent and more vulnerable. They just could not be. They've only just been born, the poor little things. And it also suggests the deprivation and the poverty, etc. But I would argue that the nakedness suggests how innocent and vulnerable these poor little baby girls are. And then again, this listing of garbage stuffed in bags, abandoned at the doorstep, it's dehumanising them, hiding them as well, you know, covering them in the garbage and the bags and abandoning them, may suggest shame, may suggest that they can't look at the baby as they do this. But again, it's very stark language, suggesting how regularly this horrible event occurs. One of them was dug up by a dog. Quite blunt imagery here. Um, Again, suggests it's quite horrific that they're just nothing. That they're dug up by a dog. They're, you know, lower than a dog in terms of hierarchy. Thinking that the head barely poking above the ground was bone or wood, something to chew. Very horrific. The idea that these poor little babies could be harmed. So it just suggests it makes the reader feel sympathetic and wanting to help, and you can see why the mother goes to help and why, you know, America and other countries go to support these babies, because just the notion of it is just awful. And then we've got this single line stanza, this is the one my mother will bring. Now the idea of that word, this idea of the word one, suggests that maybe because this baby in particular has suffered so much, and gone through so much, it's been naked, it's been covered, it's been dug up by a dog, it's gone through so much that maybe this one is the one that they want to rescue. Um, we can talk about white savior um, ideas potentially, or you may want to discuss them in lessons, etc., or maybe in the comments. But you could argue that this poem is all about how Western societies almost feel that we are better than other cultures, and we feel like we must save the other cultures. Um, Now, admittedly, in infanticide, I would argue that any culture should be rescuing the poor little babies, but it's interesting that it is an American family or American woman rescuing the poor little baby. Moreover, Milwaukee Airport, USA, the parents wait at the gates. So bear in mind, the parents of the baby are the new adoptive parents, or adoptive parents, not the woman who's brought the baby from India to America. She is passing it on to the parents who have adopted the poor little thing. They, the parents, are Americans, so they know about ceremony and tradition, about doing things right. And as I say, when I was talking about that white saviour idea, it's, well, what makes anything right? Why do America think that they know exactly what is right, and do America do everything right? Again, that's up for debate. I am not for 1 second suggesting anyone, don't care where you're from, should leave the babies. They should be rescued, etc. But it's interesting that that notion of America knows about doing things right is there. So you might want to consider that. They, again the parents, haven't seen or touched her yet. They don't know of her fetish for plucking hair off hands or how her mother tried to bury her. So you've got the new parents who haven't yet met her, but they've got all this to discover about the poor little baby, or not poor anymore, it's being rescued. The idea of fetish for plucking hair off hands. The baby isn't some weird little demon baby. It's, if you can imagine a newborn baby, it's just almost stroking, kind of, I say pinching, but it's not really pinching because they haven't got the strength, but just playing with hands, and they just sort of grab at things. I'm sure if you've ever been around young children, you'll know they're just very grabby. So you've got that, but this woman who's taken her from India to America knows this already. So within that however long flight, she's learnt little bits about the baby. And then you've got the very lovely, affectionate, intimate gesture of this baby, almost like stroking, I suppose, the hand. And then it's immediately juxtaposed with the horrific reality of the baby's heritage, of how her mother tried to bury her. So it's almost like her past will never be gone. It'll always be uh, following her around. But they are crying. So the parents are crying. We couldn't stop crying, my mother said, feeling the strangeness of her empty arms. So you've got the dialogue there. The narrator's mum is saying we couldn't stop crying. So again, she's united in that crying, of the relief and of the um, that through the rescue of this baby. It must be quite emotional to save a baby, and a newborn baby at that, and then bring them to parents who can potentially give it a better life and save it from, well, death that it would have got elsewhere. So it must be very emotional. But at the same time, the narrator's mother is also feeling the loss of the baby. She's had this journey from India to um, America, and I'm not going to say she's fallen in love with the baby, but she has a love for the baby, and it feels odd for her empty arms. She just wants to love on that baby and look after it and so on. So there's that sadness there for her, even though she knows it is for the greater good. Next, this girl grows up on videotapes, sees how she's passed from woman to woman. She returns to Twilight Corners. So this final section, it's untitled, which I think is interesting. I argue that's because it's years later and so on. This girl is growing up, and despite, it doesn't matter how great her life in America is, it could be the greatest life of all time, she will always know where she's come from. She knows that she was passed from woman to woman, so from her biological mother to the convent, from the convent to the narrator's mother, from the narrator's mother to her adoptive parents, and so on. She's been passed from female to female to escape that hellish fate that could have got her, essentially. So she returns to Twilight Corners to the day of her birth. So she's thinking back on her birth, how it happens in some desolate hut outside village boundaries. So again, as I said, it's quite rural. It's outside of the village because again, no one wants to be complicit in a poor little baby's death. So you've got to consider that idea. So they are outside, away from everybody else. Where mothers go to squeeze out life, watch body slither out from body, feel for penis or no penis, toss the baby to the heap of others, trudge home to lie down for their men again. You've got the idea of the mother's going to squeeze out life. Now, if we go back, you know it's from the rural, the outside of the boundaries of the village. So again, they're doing it in maybe secrecy or maybe just, I don't want to say embarrassment, but kind of shame that they don't want to be seen to be doing this. And that verb squeeze out life, you've got the literal, they are squeezing the baby out of their body, like through childbirth, but also squeezing out life as in squeezing out its air, like killing it. So you've kind of got the double meaning there. And watch baby slither out from body. Again, you've got that quite dark imagery. Like no one describes giving birth as a baby slithering out. It's quite negative imagery to the birth, but as you can understand, these poor Indian women would have a negative view on this birth because they didn't want to give birth, but because of the lack of contraception, they had no choice. Feel for penis or no penis, toss the baby to the heap of others, because obviously some children, boy children, are valued more than girl children. And that verb toss the baby to the heap of others, again shows the multitude of girl babies that this is occurring with, and it's quite blasé, toss the baby. It's just, very blasé, very just blunt about what they're doing. And finally, trudge home to lie down for their men again. It shows the idea of the passiveness and the submissiveness of the women in this culture, and the idea that they feel they have no choice. Males are dominant, and therefore the women have no choice. And that verb trudge suggests that they don't want to do it. It suggests there's a reluctance, but they have no choice. Now, interestingly, this is the first time that men are mentioned in the poem. The entire poem is usually from woman to woman and girls and so on. But only at the end is the men mentioned because they've had no part in this. Not to say that they are in any way innocent in what they've done, absolutely not. But it almost shows how dismissive they are and how lack of caring they are to the event. They know what will occur if they have sex with a female with no contraception, or the risk of that, but they just don't care, because ultimately to potentially these men, it's the woman's problem, and that's why the women go outside of boundaries and so on. In terms of key structural features, the poem is broken into sections with different subheadings to emphasise the different attitudes and practices of the different cultures and societies being discussed within the poems. The final section is an unspecified setting and location which could potentially be an attempt to bridge the gap between these two societies to reinforce this ongoing problem. Furthermore, it could symbolise the transgression of moral boundaries and the shame of the practices that this culture dictates. The use of end-stop lines gives the poem a harsh and matter-of-fact tone. There are few references to emotions, suggesting the lack of disassociation that Indian mothers have to maintain in order to cope with their reality. And finally, the breaking down of the structure towards the end of the poem could reflect the lack of control anyone in this society has to change the situation. And the final bleak single-sentence stanza suggests that this cycle of suffering will continue. Now, the exam board's interpretation is as follows. This uncompromising short sequence lays bare, in the starkest language the infanticide of girl babies in India. While the language used is bald in the extreme, a troubling psychological depth is added by the complex relationships in the poem between the narrator, her mother, the foster child, and the baby's new parents in America. These unspoken relationships call into question the nature of family bonds. Take the word sister in the first line, for instance, which refers to the nun but hints at a lost relationship between the narrator and the foster baby. The use of the short sequence form enables the poet to explore this situation from different perspectives. It perhaps also suggests, in its shift of time and place, both the invisible global connections which link West and East, the developed and developing world, and the fracturing of family relationships. The lack of figurative or descriptive language contributes to a flatness of tone, expressive of the bleakness of the situation. Single-syllable verbs thud against the lines from a brutal emphasis on the physical. The potential of new life is reduced to something less than a body. To wood, bone, garbage. The one outburst of emotion, "we couldn't stop crying," takes place in America. Back in India, the women who feel for penis or no penis cannot afford to confront their experience. The language returns to a kind of numbness as they go through the terrible motions of sex and birth. Grim though the events described are, the poem does not lay easy blame. The women who display such apparent heartlessness towards the girl babies are seen in the final part to be at the mercy of society, which privileges male children. They are victims too. Even the men they lie down for, the poem hints, are trapped by cultural and economic pressures. So, model paragraph here. How does Doshi present suffering in the Deliverer? The theme of suffering is established at the beginning of the poem through the stark acknowledgement of the cultural value and lack thereof placed of certain children in India, who are abandoned due to being crippled or dark or girls. The syndetic, that should say not asyndetic, syndetic listing, suggests these traits are undesirable and that through no fault of their own, children are disposed of. Furthermore, the matter-of-fact tone used to describe their abandonment, covered in garbage, stuffed in bags, suggests the determination to get rid of them and furthers the sense of dehumanization. However, the verbs covered and stuffed could also allude to the secret suffering of the mothers and their internal shame for having to dispose of their own children, which ultimately inspires a sense of sympathy as they have no choice in this. So as usual, I've got the websites that you might want to look at on the board. And in terms of additional tasks to develop your ideas, look at the verbs that relate directly to the girl babies and their mothers. And what do you notice about them? What effect do they have? You might want to consider that. What are the moral implications of the poem? Consider the relative goodness of each character, so the nun, the narrator's mother, the foster parents, and the village men and women. And finally, in what ways does Doshi encourage a reader to form their own moral viewpoint of the events described in the poem?